bodies of work with lots of potential topics, I think, that could link together a discussion. Our point of an evening like this is to actually allow the conversation to happen between you. I think, in fact, this is an audience that will know this work in various forms already. We, and all of us very much appreciate the presentations to see to see the things that you're thinking about as work like this evolves. What I try and do isn't so much ask a series of additional questions to lay on top of it, as much as say this is an opportunity for the four of you to sit down and from the different perspectives of Zurich, Berlin, Cambridge, Munich, to bring questions to the table towards one another. And so I'm going to hold off for a minute on a few questions that seem urgent to me, but to say, is there anything that, as you're seeing this, that you now want to ask one another? This is an opportunity for those kinds of conversations, I think. And there are obviously some topics and themes that run through it about material, relationships of part to whole, cross-disciplinary knowledge or transfer of technologies. But what's coming up as you watch the others present here? What's the first question you might want to...
For me, I mean, one of the issues was scalability. I think this idea of moving. So I think Michael mentioned it, and Fabio also. Chris, I'll get to you in a minute. But this idea of scalability, and particular, for example, the winery project, bringing that up, and say the collaboration with Des Platzes, and bringing that, if that's an ideal situation. It seems like these systems, even in our own case, there's a certain point where the system, I think one example was scaling things from industry up to the scale of architecture, and the sort of problems of doing that when these are these kind of accumulating systems where it seems like there's a certain point where you have to bypass that or allow other systems. In your case, it might have been the collaboration or this idea of scalability. I think you were talking about the idea of the pavilion being a good case study because it's unburdened by typology or mechanical issues or more complex structural issues. So I think in these things, I think it's interesting for me to think of where that sort of collapses, or you have to continue or add or take on other systems to enable an architecture in its complexity, or even a car in its complexity. And it seems like these things, that there is a point where you have to rely on other techniques or to see it through.
Yeah, I really like the part-to-whole problem. I mean, it goes with scalability to a certain degree, and it's something that really is a problem potentially for all, except for you. In a way, you have it kind of wrapped up a little more tightly as a, let's say, as a whole to begin with. You're sculpting, let's say, a whole, and then figuring out the kind of relation part to whole in a more, let's say, synthetic manner, where it's probably in some of the work that I was showing, and even Gramazio, your work, the bottom-up strategies, let's say, of aggregation and things like this, produce an inherent problem, which is, I think, is interesting, but an inherent problematic of how you define the limits of it, or where you stop. And is it just when the machine runs out of gas, or do you have a moment when you say that's the whole relationship, in a sense, that's right, or are you not even interested in that anymore? You know what I mean? Like, that's the kind of questions that, like, in a way, that the image problem of architecture, which is a whole problem, and architects have dealt with it as, like, all holes at once. This is what, like, I would say camps are right now in architectural discipline. It's like, if you can make, I did this as for a studio, if you take, like, that Krauss diagram and you replace it with part, whole, no hole, you get, like, the no whole part, you get the collage people, you get the part to whole, you get the synthetic projects of, let's say, the parametric total thing. If you have the whole and no parts, you get the cartoon project, figurative thing. And if you get the no part, no whole, you end up with something else, which is like, I don't even know what it is yet. But but I think the work that we're showing is kind of a way to get out of that kind of compositional problem of the part to whole. I mean, which is a burden, a disciplinary burden that we have since art, like, probably, I don't know, since probably whenever, but it's like it seems like forever in my lifetime, but it probably wasn't that long. So what do you do? When do you stop? When are you satisfied? Because I love the research, but when it becomes grapes in a building, in a square building, I think, it could be so much more. It seems like so much more, so much more potential. And I think the research is awesome, and I feel like I know it's the first. You just needed a vehicle to test it. It was like that was it. But like the first thing you do is produce an image of grapes. I think maybe you could look at the. I don't know. Like the stuff you did in the Venice is probably more on the lines of what I think you would start going with it. Start looking at like the serpentine wall problem, structural walls, curvature.
So now we addressed at least 2 topics.
I don't know. We're just talking.
I just maybe be coming back to the question of scalability.
Yeah.
I think you cannot scale architecture or constructive system. When I talk about scalability, I intended the process or the speed of the process or the efficiency of the process, because what we do in the lab is slow, and of course we care of automating or solving just the part of the process that are relevant to the design or to the result. When you have to do 1,000 square meters of something, then you need another process, an industrial process, and then you have to invest some money and to find partners in order to make this possible. I think if the starting assumption is wrong, if you would have experimented with, brick scale 1 to 10, then this wouldn't work. You cannot say, okay, now let's do it larger. This would crash. It would be, and this happens a lot into architecture. You're working on a model scale and skipping the real thing.
I'm interested in the real, but I think you can do it the other way too. I think this is an interesting split. It's like how can you bring the real into the computer? Like we're really trying hard, and it may not be possible, is to because we don't have, let's say, the space you do, and we don't have robots. But the to start to think about mass and weight. And so we produce environments with physics software and with physics engines, real-time physics calculations, so that we can actually test it in a space that has forces on it. So when we're testing our bricks, they all have weight, a mathematical idea of weight, at least. They're all within a mathematical area of physics, and we can do things that we can't get to with just our hands, let's say. We can test things that are at a scale much greater than ourselves, our bodies even. And I think for us that's an exciting potential to look at things, let's say if we're all interested in the real as a mode of operating, that the real is always mediated, and we can look at that real in a digital environment as well as in a physical environment. So,
I mean, it seems to be a kind of assignment, and I think that happened here is like what happens when the brick, in terms of its weight, has to do with working an 8-hour shift. It shifts to kind of robotic, and that can scale up or sort of scale across that whole range of weight and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that you can model a lot of things, and that simulation are very strong tools. But in our experience, even in practice experience of the office where we build, where you have to build models, mock-ups and things to show to the client, is that doing it for real is always much more efficient, much stronger, because it obliges you to stay or to answer the question, okay, how do you do it?
Yeah.
If you take things in hand, you will.
Sure.
I mean,
but at a certain point, let's say when you're an architect, you don't always have to do. You think it. I hope at a certain point, we become seasoned architects, and you understand the problems of construction, and you can start to draw it. I mean, the project of architecture has existed. The idea that we're actually going to be making all of our buildings ourselves is kind of a problem of scale at a certain level. Like I was saying to Frank, just won this big urban planning project, and I was like, well, good luck with trying to fabricate. How do you work at that scale all of a sudden? Because then you're dealing at a whole other scale. You're not going to get out there and try to.
Of course, yeah. I'm addressing the scale of the works I have shown and of construction.
So there's always a level, I think, of abstraction still. I don't think that. I think there's always I think we're no longer at Ophelos, and only because the problem he worked with houses, and you could go out there on site and you say, I'm not going to draw. I'm just going to move walls around with workmen and say, hey, that's better over here. And when you start to deal with larger institutional projects, and even in, let's say, the political social climate that we were dealing with, you can't. You have to work within a representational environment ultimately. So how do you deal with that? That distance is inevitably there between us and the
with
thing we make.
simulation. I mean, there I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
But those works and at least our practice is very much based on experiments. Those works are or happen into the school, so it's about people that do not have this knowledge. Because I agree, once you know a system, once you have know what the system performs, then you have an abstraction, then you have the simulation, and you have in your head, and you can design with it. But when you do the first steps, starting to finding out a new system, then it's very, very helpful if you know the real constraints of the problem. And those are not just physical. I mean, I didn't address it enough, but I thought what Chris said is very true and dramatic in architecture too. So if you do not answer how you physically do things, then you do not know how much it costs, and then you are limited, what you said, to large, expensive museum or Prada shops, where it doesn't matter how much it costs. But this is not architecture at large. I mean, the large reality.
There's a chance to become more of a
prototypical.
Universal system or a universal approach. I mean, the other thing, and I wanted to get to Chris, was this issue of surface, where it seems like we're dealing again with a kind of construction dimension. That kind of surface is a kind of construction thickness or weaving. It seems like, Chris, again, I'm curious. I mean, you're always seeing sort of architecture leading something like what you're doing, and the way you're addressing surface, it seems to be about something that's happening in a thickness that's like that. So I was just curious, because it seems like you're in a position to sort of be informing our discipline rather than following. But
how interesting.
Yeah, that's what I would think. It's scary for me to see architecture as a
class.
class.
For the first time, that what happens when you introduce a kind of capability or solving in architecture. So it does seem to be, it could be a situation that is kind of moving back and forth between itself. But I was really interested because, I mean, your famous critique about surface is that you are the guys that are in control of that, and we're the guys that are dealing with space and tectonics, but as a kind of discipline that you understand at a different level. And I still think that's an interesting thing to hear about.
Okay, I mean, I'm still convinced of that. And I mean, that's because we have a fetishism about surface. To us, it's about perfect surface. And that's why to leave that, as we propose in some of the pictures you saw with faceted surfaces, which are under the current thought not perfect, that's quite radical. But what interests me in all your work is, it seems what I'm seeing here is you're dealing with surface, but the underlying issue is a structural and a functional one, which the simulations get very quickly to an understanding. Does this work? Does it hold? Does it replace? Is it better? Is it faster? Etc. And it doesn't really seem like that breakthrough has happened there, where we can say that it truly is at a level where it's beyond decorativeness, and it's gone into the performative. Oh, that's a good word I learned from you. Good. We don't use words like that. Yeah, right. Into the performance aspect of it, which interests, let's say, me as a car guy, because if surface doesn't have that basic performance behind it, then the car's carrying too much weight, it's too hard to make, you can't afford it, and stuff like that. It's really, really real, right on the hair edge. But we discovered in applying your approaches, we can get more performance out of cars. I mean, you can use flat surfaces to get better aerodynamics.
Yeah, that's cool.
Nobody knew that before.
Yeah. Low res.
So when you talk about scalability, to you guys, it seems to me it's something you can almost deal on paper. I'm interested in, I see the scalability happening also on the doing level. The most interesting picture was at one of the two cubes, the little brick and the colossal brick. To me.
The robot brick.
Yeah, the robot brick. Also because I'm having a house made in Italy and I'm paying for those bricks, okay? And they do lay bricks this big too, So, I mean, these guys will do that. But that was really fascinating because now the whole idea of, well, what is a brick that big? It's not a solid chunk of marble. How would you make a brick that's a meter by a meter? Then insulation comes into it to me,
Yeah, sure.
And it becomes a different structural issue as well. I thought that was kind of cool.
I mean, a term that does seem to run through each of your presentations is something like physics, in the sense that it's on the one hand, being simulated in a software modeling world with a physics engine that's running alongside the space of that modeling world, the physics of the robot and its limitations and the fact that they're related to something other than the human body and the discipline that organizes the material a certain way, the physics of machines that are cutting manipulated standard elements, the stainless steel tubes, and obviously the physics of cars and the movement of these bodies through space. And I'm just wondering if there's, it wouldn't be so much looking for the correlation that would sort of justify this all as a larger project, but it clearly is putting physics...
Or the physical, visceral, even like material.
Yeah, these kinds of experiments are making physics not so much a series of forces to negotiate, which you can say is the history of structural engineering, the history of the discipline of building, as much as they're bringing them into the project itself to help find things like form, skins, surfaces, and in that way, actually, the models that we could turn to, I would think, lie in something like, and I know this is part of Frank's interest, the history of conceptual art movements.
Absolutely.
That have seen, you know, in Robert Morris, a theory of form and sculpture coming through what felt does on the wall.
Sure.
And letting the felt become a part of the team.
Yeah.
And I guess that, you know, one question for each of you would be, how do you let the physics work with you within the different teams? You know, how do you reorganize the studio, what you think of as the studio that you do this work in? Sometimes it's a laboratory, sometimes it's a building site. How do you reconfigure the studio space itself to allow these kind of things to emerge? And that's actually where the exhibition idea next door started. We were just walking through Frank's studio, and all these funny pieces were laying around next to his buildings.
Yeah, it's very inspiring.
Which I was there actually to work on, you know, to look at one of the buildings. And in fact, all this other stuff is just laying around.
Emerging. Yeah.
And you realize, well, it'd be interesting to just put that together as a body of work, to talk about how you guys in the studio capture that, and then retain the knowledge. And maybe if you could just touch briefly on this question of how conscious you are of how you're organizing your studios or design teams or projects to allow that kind of discovery to happen.
Yeah. Well, yeah, for me, it almost goes to that question of redefining what a practice is or how a practice actually works. So I think for us it was, instead of everything being sort of very linear and goal-oriented, you do this, you do this, the client, you do this, that it was kind of opening up this space in the practice that could produce things that might be floating in a way, that might not necessarily have a direct correlation or assignment, you know, this works with this project, works with this. So in a way, at the same time, it's hard to maintain that, you know, it's hard to sort of assign this person and this person and this person. So there's been other venues, like say this, or the exhibition that somehow enables or allows that to happen. But in a way, it was this idea of just simply opening up these areas, and again, it seemed to be a process that evolves, that you can add to and change, but and it's created these other alignments that didn't exist as sort of, you know, like 2 years ago. So I think that's been interesting in just sort of opening that up. But it's something that has to be sort of cultivated or maintained in the practice, which needs these other things. You know, if an urban scale assault could somehow benefit or take some of this stuff, and then it would be super cool where you can allow some of these things to overlap on other things that are less predictable or more unpredictable conditions. So that's become quite interesting for us.
That mix of the unpredictable and the predictable, that I think is a very important part of a studio environment today.
Failure.
Yeah. We started doing these type of intuitive projects where we put people together and just said, just do art in whatever medium you want, a sewing machine, goop on a painting, or whatever. And then we began to photograph it and mash up the photographs under different types of illumination conditions, and out of it emerged types of images and thoughts that were still very abstract, but people could begin to relate to. And then the sense of carness you could extract from it after about 4 or 5 levels of that, instead of starting with the idea of carness and then seeing how do we apply shapes to it. Yeah,
that's cool.
It's an interesting, but you have to have people who feel comfortable with that and they don't feel inhibited.
Well, I said, like talking about surface, that there's assumption about what a good curve is, you know, which goes to kind of a kind of rule-based approach to, say, surface making. And it seems like what's changed your project has been challenging all these assumptions about how surface should be made or how it could be made.
Do you remember the material? I didn't have the pictures of it. The materiality project we did. We asked a couple of young designers do 4 instrument panels, which is a pretty classic part of a car, right? But in 4 materials: in cloth, in aluminum and carbon fiber, in granite, and in wood. Mm-hmm. And the granite, they just went into the quarries, they hacked it out with the guys there, and they carved that son of a bitch. It was that big. And when this thing got done, it had every possible stone surface awareness in it. It was wonderful. There were parts of it when you hit it with your ring, stone can have a wonderful ringing to it. The wood one, just to tell you quickly, they went to a guy who does wood laminations hand formed. So they put all the wood laminates in an ice river for weeks, and then they waded in there with rubber boots and they wrestled the wood around into shapes in free form. And I mean, it came back the most inspiring set. I mean, when we rolled these up to the board of directors and told them they're just going to have experience now. They are not here to make a decision. They're just having an experience. That was wonderful to watch.
How'd they do?
Effect. They did pretty good.
I think the idea of how you structure practice today is an interesting problem. For us, we don't have any of the burdens of, let's say, success like you guys do. So we're pretty loose. I mean, we have programmers in the office, we do shit in our office that we don't even necessarily understand what we're doing at the moment. I mean, it's just constantly. I mean, we've kind of. We have some work, and I'm hoping it just goes away, honestly, at a certain point, that we can just
do stuff.
Yeah, just have a little more fun in the office. And I think for us, we're in this moment right now where I think everybody is, more or less, in the discipline, is in a, I mean, at least from my perspective, of really trying to search for some new methodologies and new ways of thinking about architecture. So for us, it's like very much indebted. I know Frank and we talk about this a lot. I think indebted to like that art historical discourse you were talking about, and even I think it's an architectural discourse of the avant-garde, and recouping a kind of avant-garde mentality which has been lost in this for the sake of, let's say, the practitioner, and so. That's where we're at. I mean, I don't know how that goes.
I mean, I think part of it can also, you can imagine it is a discipline like architecture learning new languages also too. I mean, there's in fact shared platforms, technologies that are clearly making conversations like this possible, even across disciplines. But it's still interesting for me when we sit down at a table to listen to the difference in the kind of words that a car designer uses, where we'll hear a word like emotion or experience, which I haven't heard in this building in years, and particularly in relation to a machinic approach to design systems or parametric tools or things that are treated in a very different manner, even though it's the same platform. And I think the question of emotion and experience, which runs through art discourses maybe much more strongly than architecture in the last 30 or 40 years, is maybe a way for us to start to frame the conversation between disciplines, to see what that does in car design and what it means to capture an emotional experience. Industrial designers do it all the time. Products have emotion, they have experience. It's part of the reason we get so attached to some of these things that are otherwise just a chunk of aluminum. But architects don't have that language. In
it's tricky. I get really nervous about it.
Exactly.
Thinking, like, how does this thing make me feel good or not? I think that I think that's really interesting, though. I mean, I think that nervousness is actually an interesting thing. I'm not saying I just don't know how to process it yet because I've been so trained in a
the discipline knows, you could say.
In a let's say systems logic. Explain it so that you have the idea of any willfulness even. Yeah. And this is actually part of that history of non-composition, let's say, or the avant-garde. It's really been about erasing oneself from the process, right? So that idea of the willful artiste is that thing that we've all been trying to kind of, we get nervous about. We don't know what, the worst thing you could say to most architects, is, except for Frank Gehry, who I love, is that you're an artiste. It freaks people out. Try to say that to some of my colleagues. They will go nuts on you. It's like you're throwing down the gauntlet, and ready to fight, So I think it's an interesting observation. What do you do with that? Yeah, some architects.
Remember we were talking earlier, we were talking about gestural representation of things and how it's not untypical for car designers to kind of dance their cars.
Yeah.
And I asked you, well, why don't you dance your architecture, right? Let's see your building as a dance.
Yeah, man. I would.
Everybody
do a
said
break
dancing
dance?
about architecture
Yeah,
is the worst thing you can do. Well, why not?
I know. I'm really interested in it, but I have a hard time. I mean, I've been teaching studios where students just produce films. They delete the architecture from a whole. This is the last thing I just did. We did an Eisman studio. We redid an Eisman studio where they produced no buildings, only films of buildings that didn't exist. So in a way, it was like trying to do an Eisman thing, which I think is part of this non-composition, in a way to erase Eisman even. Yeah. So he I don't know what he thought about it. He just made comments like maybe I should just lie down on the floor right here. So he was getting kind of worked up about it. But so that kind of narrative, I think, of the avant-garde, and I get upset when he says like the avant-garde's dead, because I don't want it to be, and I don't think anybody does right now. I think there's a moment, especially in this kind of economic situation, that the avant-garde is needed, perhaps, or necessary as a way to rethink the discipline, because practice is frankly gotten pretty boring. I mean, from my perspective, you've seen everything, every form you've ever thought you could ever see, and so what?
Triangles.
It's almost like I went to spend some time in China. I think, wow, China's really killed architecture, like that architecture as I knew it, because everything has been made. You go, and it's been made by other, people you've never even heard of, and it's actually not that bad. So, so what do we do? So I think there's a lot of real soul searching and really rethinking what we're doing as architects at this moment, and that's what's pretty exciting. And a lot of it has to do with the people like these people here that I'm over my shoulder.
Which I think was a good segue. If I can open it up to questions now from the audience, shall we do that? And you guys can keep thinking of questions for one another, but let's turn to the audience. Questions? No questions. Okay.
You wanna?
Question for Frank. How do you merge what's intentional with what's not intentional? I mean, clearly in your practice there's a side which is solving problems, i.e. buildings, and a side which is more research and non-intentional. And in your mind or in your experience, how do you merge? I can see that accidents happen and might lead to things that weren't expected, and you might find an application for them or not in architecture or building or other form of building. But how do you work on both those aspects of your practice?
I mean, I guess maybe this sounds old-fashioned, but I still think it's. I still see it as process-based, and really seeing architecture that may start with something completely outside of the discipline, but I still see it as a kind of series of transformations. So, and that has to do with choices, making choices along a way. So again, I guess we're still trying to produce enough, again, archiving and produce enough, in a way, I guess, a critical mass that we have this, then we can employ these things that we're kind of producing. So it might have a value, it might not have any value at all. So this issue of failure and success, it creates, in a way, a kind of field that we can choose from. But I think there's, at the same time, there's a series of staging or choices where an idea or something that's operating at a very abstract level will transform, will move, again, we try to reverse processes where, materials coming in a much earlier phase or techniques or tectonic. But I think there's still that process of discussing and fighting and slugging things out and to do that. So I don't think that it never produces a kind of dead-end situation. It produces arrays of selections that you can kind of move on. So I think it's also the way that practices work. And also, I think one important thing that works also, and I think with your thing, it seems to be that each project problem seems to generate its own issues. So that there doesn't need to necessarily be this continuity of signature, like in the worst sense of the word, but you could do something that would be completely oppositional in every sense, syntactically, materially, formally with the project before. So there's this kind of, how would you call it, a nonchalance or a way to kind of move around that I guess I would argue didn't exist in a practice, say, 20 years ago. That you're, you know, if you looked at the array of these guys' project or these guys' or even the section on the cars, it seems like there's this kind of maneuverability that didn't exist, I would say, in terms of, again, practice project, you know, even 20 years ago. So that's a kind of more extended answer to your question. But again, nothing really dead ends, so you can continually to move.
Which I think also asks the question about failure. You know, you could say all four of the practices are deeply experimental. The work you're showing is, in fact, vested in continuous forms of experiments. But in a presentation, it seems we tend to emphasize success. In fact, I'm just thinking about the hour of presentations. Where did the failure lie in any of that? And there might, I guess the question would be, do you have examples you could point to of a particular kind of failure that then led you in a different direction, or is it that all things remain alive in the sense that you're hinting at, Frank, that maybe we'll pick up on it next year or the year after?
I think failure implies, I mean, at least there's real failures, right? Structure, material failures. But I think failure also implies a kind of, let's say, index that you can relate it to, and you can say it doesn't stand up to that thing. And I think right now that index of, what do you want to call the failure index, only doesn't exist in a, let's say, I don't know, maybe it does somehow in an aesthetic way. I'm trying to think if it does or doesn't. This is like on the spot thinking here. But I feel like it exists as a physical thing, but I don't know if it exists as like an aesthetic thing, only because we haven't built those indexes yet to test it against. So.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I think I didn't talk about failure. Normally I do, because all those experiments are, if you think about the time frame and the students then are not able to program and so on, the risk to fail is enormous. And we are astonished that maybe we had 1-2 experiments that failed or that didn't come to a point, but most of them produced something. Of course, now, depending on what standards you set, you could say the polyurethane foam thing, what do you use it for? So it's a failure because we do not have any mass-producible acoustic panels. But out of it's not like the brick wall. You can say, okay, let's produce it. On the other hand, as long as you do it into the school, the academia, it's not a failure at all, because it triggers discussion, it triggers new questions, and so on and so on. The problem, to come back to your question about the studio work and so on, we are very happy to have this position at ETH now, not just because we have a huge machine and money and so on, but because we have this freedom to do experiments. And I don't know how you experience it, in the architectural praxis, every building you do not build is a failure. Doesn't matter if it's interesting to us, to you, or so on. In economical term, because you're spending money, you have people working on it, and yeah, you don't get back any money, then you can close down the whole thing. So I'm not saying that those two things should be distinct, but there is a pressure out there, in the economic reality of the production of architecture, to produce just safe things, just things that do not have any risk to fail, that you at least have done once before, and so on, that you know the whole calculation in advance. And this is one problem in the practice. The other problem is that because of our education and the majority of the concurrence that is still drawing forms. We, with our system, have the problem that first we have to have a good idea, then we have to test or to build a system. You have seen it here. Do this in an office where you pay people. Then once you have it, then you have to start to investigate the performance of the system. If you take competition, if you do not have a fundus, so a set of things that you can work with, the competition, you can draw a complex competition in 2 months. In 2 months, you will never develop such a system. So when you have to give in the competition, the other have drawn the plans, you're still working or thinking or experimenting on the basic system. I'm not saying that, we are believing this because we do it and we have some success with it, but we feel a lot of times we have to oblige ourselves to be hard there and to say, okay, now let's go through the system, because we have experienced that once you have the system, and there I would like to disagree with you. We do not feel at all slave of a system. Once the system works, then you have a great freedom, because then you get back all your authorship. You have something other cannot do. You can start to understand the potential, also the limits of the system, and to design with it. And then you can go back to very basic.
I say slave to this. I mean, I actually think it's liberating.
We are not erasing ourselves through the system. It's not our will. We want.
Oh, but that's the history, though, of the
of course,
systematic.
yeah, I know.
I think, though, you do, in the sense, even look at how you show your names in your logo.
Of course.
You know, they're erased, even in a sense. And I think I think it's inevitable in that kind of practice. I mean, it's also research one is where I don't look at that work and I don't think that's a Gramazio project so much. I see it as a set of research that's in a broader sense that's happening in the discipline. Maybe I should. I don't want to. I mean, I think that's. I don't see it as, let's say, authorship. I could see it just as easily as within a larger set of people thinking about figuration and modularity, which is a whole body of work that has been going on for a while. Not people haven't been doing it with robots, but
Yeah.
So
That's interesting. I just wanted to add one comment on to your question about how do you get this intentional and unintentional to work together. Basically, in car design, there is no real research that has been done. They only do contextual translation, where they try to understand what customers might like of this, that, and the other thing, or they try to do inspirational shape finding. But research per se to see what happens if, and we have no idea, and when it's done, can we deal with it? Basically, no one really had been doing, and I think the GINA projects and other ones were some of the real first ones of that. And to do that, you can only justify it within the industrial context because, I mean, this is a company with shareholder value and they don't want to just throw money out the window. If you can show that that belongs to a looping project of reaching out, coming back, then reach out again, come back in different ways. And I think, although I would never want to call GINA a failure, I think it's a fantastic start of a whole new philosophy. What is most interesting, however, was how it inspired the metal guys to say, we can do metal like that. We can make metal work like cloth. Oh, really? Let's see you do it. And they put together a systems, and in fact they call it GBK, Gina Blechkleid, which allowed us to make hoods on Z4s, which no one could have ever done before. So that type of thing was also quite interesting as a result.
I think I saw a question. Yeah.
hey, how's it going?
In all your work about digital fabrication, it's mostly about a very bottom-up kind of approach on design. And while the other side of architecture, which doesn't concern itself so much with digital fabrication, is mostly about top-down kind of design, like the ones we see at Foster's or Zaha or some of these practices. And in terms of the aesthetic, there's a very distinct difference in the way those buildings are seen and the way the buildings that are more focused on digital fabrication are seen. Do you ever see a sort of a coming together of these two kind of techniques that would ever inform each other? And let's say digital fabrication could work on top-down design buildings rather than buildings that are just designed from the bottom up.
I think they always come together because, I mean, now we are showing extreme project, showing an extreme position, but you cannot, as an architect, think and work and act just bottom up. It doesn't work. You need the other approach to complement it. What does not work, for sure, is to instrumentalize the bottom-up approach to the top-down approach. So in order to say this is the most common mistake, misunderstanding, reason of failure of architecture, to say, okay, let's design this top-down and somehow the digital fabrication guy will produce it. Nobody knows how. And if there is a lot of money, then it gets done, but most of the time it's not really good. Because there is no real personal union in those two approaches that have to influence each other all the time.
Yeah,
It's a way of thinking
yeah.
that
I
kind
think
of
what you don't
stuff.
see, like in an exhibition like you don't see all this other
Yeah,
body of
yeah.
work. You know that there's all these other tactics and strategies for putting a building together. That this, so it makes it's almost like an illusion that it all happens like that from the scale of the brick to this complex programmatic thing. And I really, but I think the argument is that, and what actually happens is I think a lot of this stuff is happening parallel to each other. So, but it was, I think, again, a kind of resurrecting this idea and how does digital craft materiality, how could it have a significant role in terms of driving these things? But I don't think it's a simple 180 reversal of how we work. So, so the next talk could be about tactics of site, or our interest in the history of landscape and how that has informed it. So I think, again, when I say it's not an exclusive thing, it isn't. And there's all these other strains of activities that inform each other in the making of the architecture. So I think it's slightly rhetorical to see the work framed like this as, digital fabrication is going to save the world, and but because there's other things happening.
Humanizing the car surface, you mentioned, to make it more emotional. I don't see the connection. I think now most of the customers, they want to personalize their cars, okay? And emotion with a surface, and by the way, you mentioned in the end, to a certain extent, I misunderstand it because I think it's a contradict, because you said you made the door with 4 materials, and the one that it makes the acoustic or the unique or you like the most, it was the granite, I think, or marble. So in a way, we are used to a car, it's a hard surface. But for example, I've seen something in Discovery Channel where they make the car, if it's read your alcohol level, it cannot start. And I think this is more functional than making the surface, just in fabric. So I don't think there is a relation of the fabrication of the outside with the emotional aspect. Because I don't know, but as a human being, when there is a affection, we want to see the other sides, reflects that our emotion.
Yeah, okay. It's really difficult to get across a whole story of car here in just this one discussion on fabrication. But I guess you would also agree with me that they're really complex objects to us. And sometimes they have huge visual emotional appeal. We like what they look like, and for some people that's enough to put a lot of money on the table. They never have to drive them. They just have to look like that. And for, I would say, most people out there, all they have to do is work. I just want them to work okay. In fact, in the English language, you can make a nice difference between car and automobile. An automobile, automobile, self-moving. An elevator is an automobile, if you want. All right? It's completely what I use. A car, cara, carrozzeria, has deep roots. It's a 2,000-year-old word it's based on. That's much more what I am and not what I use. So there are differences also within the worlds of personal mobility. And to you, the issue that you brought up of, I just missed it on, what was it, on safety? What was the last one? What was that?
The alcohol level?
Alcohol level, thank you. Is a very important one, which is valid for any type of personal mobility. It could be the driver of a bus, the driver of a truck, or driver of a car. It to me is not intrinsic to the discussion of car designness per se. It's just another feature of what personal mobility and a responsible society is all about. So I didn't want to walk over into those territories today because really we're talking about how you physically make things. But shapes are very emotional in cars. And that emotion is what has driven the biggest industry in the world. I mean, don't discount that. It has been that for a long, long time. And it's not just because people use them, it's because they want them.
I wanted to put 2 statements out there and then ask each of you to, let's say, retool these statements. So the first would be, how would you retool ornament is a crime? And the second would be, how would you retool form follows function?
Yeah. I mean, the ornament crime thing. I mean, it was always a rhetorical argument. I think we with is Oliver still here? I mean, we talked about that show on you know, looking at ornament again, and I think it was really. I would still argue that was a kind of economical dilemma rather than an ethical or moral one. And I think it's been more of a kind of technology sort of enabling or letting that back in. Again, like issues like ornament wasn't something we set out to achieve, but it was a kind of almost a byproduct of the kind of conditions we were working in rather than a kind of goal for itself. So I think that was really more of a rhetorical argument than that had to do with the kind of realities of place and desire and economics and actually being able to do that. So that, I mean, that was an interesting with the show that came up.
I'm going to pass.
You can do the second half. You can do the second half of that question.
I haven't understand the question. What do you mean by retooling?
Well, do you think form follows function, or?
For me, it's form follows function. Yeah, to a certain extent, for sure. I mean, as we know, this formula historically, it's very. I would say it's much too simplistic. It's not adequate anymore. But there is, of course, a strong connection between those two, and I think those works, as soon as it comes into a work takes into consideration real-world aspects.
Really? Come on, man! Look at those curvy.
Maybe. What?
Come on! I can't. You gotta admit there's a pleasure in the motion. If we're gonna go into this emotion thing, which I think is interesting.
No, I'm just saying. I'm not saying that it's driving the design completely. Therefore, I'm saying that the formula is outdated somehow. I'm just saying that there is a connection, at least in our work. I mean, the Venice walls for us, the design intention. I didn't explain it. It's very simple. It comes from the fabrication. You have elements, they are 4 meters long, you have to bring them in, they have to be stable. So how do you make an element stable? You make the
serpentine wall, the Jeffersonian thing. But I think,
and then you have, this is part of the function that you need to achieve to.
But irregularity isn't a functional. I mean, there's a love for obviously complexity or swarm like.
Yeah. I'm not explaining the work from this point of view. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying there is always a connection between those criteria. And then once you have set up the system, then you start to play, and then you start to express with feelings with form and to design. This is part of the freedom you get at this point.
So it's not.
But it's not completely
following. It's just. Let's say they're somehow in play at the same time.
It's not following.
Yeah.
It's a much looser connection in place there. But I would not. I would not say that there is no connection at all.
Sure.
At least in our work, there is still even a certain form of beauty coming out of this, or of emotions for us. I mean, I like cars if they are. Working well too. There is a component, an emotional component in this too, not just in the.
Sure, that's like the
Yates
quote, or whatever quote of the chase of the click of the well-made box. You know, obviously there's like a quality to something well-made that is emotional. Let's say. So I agree with that, but there's other things that play for you other than you're not doing the Swiss minimalism.
No.
You know, you're doing other kind of Swiss.
Yeah.
So
it's okay.
No, this is
My wife is Swiss. It's okay. Maybe just from my side, a comment on this. They both lines, form and function and ornament as a crime, are very close to, they always resonate within me when I have issues with modernism. I have serious personal issues with the idea of modernism because I see it very conflictually, how it's handled very conflictually with the idea of world culture and the idea that there is a certain amount of equivocation of culture that should be understood. When we showed the Z4 in Thailand, a professor there came to me and said, "Thank you for doing a non-Euclidean car." I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" He said, "All you modernists, you know, you only know geometry from Euclid." But like we didn't have him. We didn't have spheres and cubes and cones in Asia. We had a completely different other visual vocabulary. And this car looks non-Euclidean. I mean, that's how he said it to me. Oh, it's kind of interesting. And the idea of decoration, at least as I understand when I read Crime and Ornament, had a lot to do also with a huge amount of racial view of cultural disharmony, which bothers me tremendously. And that's one of the things that I was hoping, when I say that the human in the loop, like in Gina, I think there's tremendous cultural things out there to be discovered that we're just putting processes in place that are ignoring them.